Hello, today's presentation of Module 5 discusses the disclosure of resident information and Ombudsman records. This PowerPoint presentation is approximately 30 minutes long. There is a homework assignment for this module, which will be reviewed at the end of the presentation. Today we will start with a refresher on consent and confidentiality. We'll then discuss how to safeguard physical access to records, how to maintain confidentiality in person during conversations, and then we'll review our disclosure policy. After today's presentation, you'll be able to understand the importance of keeping records confidential, how to store records, and know the steps to take when you receive a records request. First, we'll talk about the disclosure of information and consent and confidentiality review. In Module 4, we discussed the importance of obtaining consent and maintaining confidentiality. To start today's presentation, let's review why this is important, as it is a good segue into today's conversation about disclosure of information and records. Many residents are frail, vulnerable, and dependent on staff for part or all of their care. They're frequently reluctant to voice their concerns or complaints in any way out of fear of mistreatment or reprisals, or being labeled as a troublemaker. Of course, we always talk to residents about their right to speak up without reprisal, but often the only way residents feel comfortable bringing their concerns to the Ombudsman or talking about conditions with the provider is with the guarantee that their confidences will be preserved. A relationship of trust must form between the Ombudsman and the resident before an Ombudsman can advocate on a resident's behalf. This trust only develops when residents can absolutely rely upon the discretion of the Ombudsman. They must be confident that their identity and the information they divulge to the Ombudsman will only be shared with their permission and only to those whom they wish the knowledge to be disclosed. The critical importance of safeguarding identities and information applies to complainants as well. Family members or friends who are concerned about a resident's well-being are usually reluctant to be identified because they are fearful of retaliation against a loved one. We also can't assume that a family member has talked with the resident about calling us, and we should always ask. Sometimes, family members don't want the resident to know they called us. Staff who depend on the provider for their livelihood must also be assured that the information they provide to the Ombudsman will be protected. Fear of retaliation is one reason confidentiality is essential to Ombudsman services. Other reasons include residents and other complainants not wanting to be viewed as complainers, desire to maintain a low profile, lack of confidence in the resolution process, and the need to protect a source of information. Anyone contacting the program must know that the confidential nature of their communications to the Ombudsman will not be breached. It's important to keep this in mind as you do your work. Remember that some information can be shared with staff so long as the information does not violate confidentiality and disclosure requirements. Here we're going to review some information that can be shared. General observations identified about the provider that do not identify any resident or complainant in any way can be shared with staff. Examples of these observations include, but are not limited to, call lights not being answered, cleanliness of the home, cluttered hallways that restrict residents and/or staff movement, odors, and visible safety hazards. None of these issues would identify a specific resident because they are broad issues. In the next few slides, we're going to go over some scenarios, and I want you to indicate if the information gathered is confidential or not, and whether the information should or should not be shared with staff. Scenario 1. You tell the housekeeper that you noticed the garbage cans in several residents' rooms are overflowing. Is this information confidential? Yes or no? Should this information be shared with staff? As an answer to scenario 1, this information is not confidential and is okay to share with staff. It is just based on your own observations and does not identify any specific residents. Moving on to scenario 2. You observe Susan's call light has been left unanswered for 35 minutes. Before you talk to Susan, you see an aide and tell them what you observed. Is this information confidential? Yes or no? Should this information be shared with staff? Yes or no? As an answer to scenario 2, this information is indeed confidential. Because this concern directly impacts Susan, it is not okay to share the information with staff without Susan's permission. In this scenario, we should talk to Susan first to see if she wants assistance from the Ombudsman program. During observations and interviews, we can then check to see if other residents have an issue with their call lights being answered in a timely manner. If so, we could talk to staff about several resident complaints about call lights. Remember, we can only use the name of a resident with their permission. Scenario 3. You tell the charge nurse about a urine odor on the 3rd floor. Is this information confidential? Yes or no? Should this information be shared with staff? Yes or no? As an answer to scenario 3, this information is not confidential and it is okay to share with staff. Moving on to scenario 4. You visit with Cynthia after her son calls you about a family conflict over Cynthia moving to another provider in Ohio. Cynthia tells you her son is causing problems and she's considering moving in with her daughter, not another provider. Cynthia says her doctor and other family members are against her moving in with her daughter, but she wants to do it regardless of what they say. You forgot to ask her if you can tell her son about her plan. Her son calls you the next day and asks you about your visit with his mother. You are worried about Cynthia's safety, so you tell him about the plan to move back into the community. Is this information confidential? Yes or no? Should this information be shared with staff? Yes or no? As an answer to scenario 4, this information is confidential. You did not receive permission to share the information with the complainant, in this case, which is Cynthia's son. Therefore, it should not be shared with either the son or the staff until permission is granted. Also, just as a side note here, it is important to note that it is not up to us to decide what is safe for Cynthia. We can ask questions about what others consider unsafe and advocate for solutions to those problems to help Cynthia achieve her goal. And do we even know if her daughter is involved in the plan? Here we will talk about safeguarding physical access. The State Long-Term Care Ombudsman is responsible for managing all files, records, and other information of the Ombudsman program. This information includes physical copies of documents, electronic information stored in OTIS, and other formats. When it comes to protecting Ombudsman files and records, safeguarding physical access to these documents is very important. Let's review some ways to keep records safe. One thing we can do is lock any hard copy files, like signed consent forms, and only letting representatives of the office have access to those forms. As volunteers, you typically won't need to have access to OTIS, but if the regional program director wants you to have access, they can make a request to the State Ombudsman. Taking records with you is always risky. Just be sure to not leave anything in your car that is confidential. If you ever obtain a copy of a resident's medical record, that should be taken to the program office and not to your home. Now that we have reviewed ways to safeguard physical access to information and records, let's talk about ways to safeguard information when we're talking to others to ensure it stays confidential. Don't share information in public. For example, if you run into a friend at a grocery store, don't share information with them about residents you just visited in your assigned facility. Keep confidential information out of the conversation with a staff member until you have reached consent to reveal identity. Now for Section 2, we'll switch gears and start talking about disclosure of Ombudsman records. Although you are the one documenting notes and obtaining consent, these records are the property of the State Long-Term Care Ombudsman. These records and files are not public records, and they cannot be shared with any party outside of our office. This means that you must follow all state and federal requirements regarding disclosure, which we'll review in a bit. These records and any information contained in them must be kept confidential. Information contained in the investigative and other files maintained by the state office and the regional programs shall be disclosed only at the discretion of the State Long-Term Care Ombudsman, or if disclosure is required by a court order. This is not something that you'll typically be involved in, as your program director or assigned ombudsman usually handles these requests. But it's important to understand the process. For example, if an administrator requests to review the records of a case at the home, you would not give them any part of the record. You would tell the administrator your record is confidential. You would then let your volunteer coordinator or assigned ombudsman know about the request for records so that they can follow the appropriate steps. Also, identities of clients, witnesses, and complainants shall not be released without a court order. For example, if the state ombudsman releases a record, all identifying information would be redacted. However, if there were a court order to release identities, all that information would have to remain in the record. Please note, the list of records included on this slide is not all-encompassing, but some examples of information that shall not be disclosed include any information within OTIS, signed consent forms, volunteer reports, and names of staff, clients, or complainants. Ombudsman records cannot be disclosed under any circumstance. If you are approached by someone asking for our records, please notify your assigned ombudsman. Disclosure of information, whether it's a resident's record or the name of a complainant, must be carefully handled. Although there are rules and policies about not disclosing information, believe it or not, there are some instances where disclosing information can be helpful and may even be used as a part of a resolution strategy for a complaint. In Module 7, we'll go over the complaint handling process. One of the requirements in handling a case is determining whether a complaint is verified, not verified, or undetermined. Ombudsmen are required to select the verification option that best describes the status of each complaint and is determined after a thorough investigation is conducted. One of the services our program provides is selection assistance. If a family member contacts the Ombudsman office and wants to help move their loved one into the home, we can provide information about providers in that area, including any verified complaints for a particular setting. This is why information about verification should be as current and accurate as possible. Ombudsman can pull verified complaints for a specific time frame in OTIS and share this information with the caller. If the family is interested in a provider that has had few complaints about visitation, we can run a report to show which facilities in the area had a lot of verified visitation complaints and which facilities in the area had very few verified visitation complaints. In Module 9, we'll go over verification reports in OTIS. On the slide here, these are just a few examples of when disclosure is helpful. As I had mentioned, when it's used as a resolution strategy or verifying complaints, but also working with the media can be when disclosure is helpful. There is a self-study for this module about confidentiality and disclosure. There will be different scenarios about confidentiality and disclosure, and you'll answer the questions. That concludes Module 5. Thank you so much.